the silence that spoke louder than words. For years, silence had wrapped itself around their names like a fragile veil, thin enough for memories to slip through, but strong enough to keep the truth hidden beneath layers of time, distance, and unspoken emotion. The world remembered Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock as smiles on red carpets, laughter caught between takes, and a chemistry that once felt effortless and alive. Yet what the world never saw was how silence can sometimes be louder than applause, how absence can echo more deeply than presence, and how two people can walk separate paths while carrying the same unanswered questions in their hearts. Keanu had learned early in life that silence was not always empty. Sometimes it was full of memories, full of things that had no proper moment to be spoken, full of emotions that waited patiently for the right time to surface. He carried himself with a calm that people often mistook for distance, but beneath that calm lived a man who felt deeply, who listened more than he spoke, and who believed that kindness did not need an audience to be real. Over the years, his life had become a rhythm of work, quiet reflection, and service to others, a way of living shaped by loss, resilience, and an understanding that pain, when acknowledged, could soften a person rather than harden them. Sandra, on the other hand, had learned to be strong in motion. She moved forward, always forward, guided by instinct, humor, and a fierce independence that had carried her through uncertainty and success alike. To the world, she was vibrant and confident, someone who filled rooms with energy and warmth. Yet in quieter moments, when the lights dimmed and the noise faded, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had never been said. Silence, for her, was not comfortable. It was something she learned to coexist with, something she managed rather than embraced, because silence reminded her of moments when she wished she had spoken sooner, braver, clearer. Years earlier, their paths had crossed in a way that felt simple at first, almost accidental, yet meaningful in a way neither of them could fully explain. There was no dramatic beginning, no grand declaration, just a shared understanding that grew in small moments, conversations that lingered longer than necessary, and glances that carried more honesty than words ever could. But life, with all its unpredictability, has a way of interrupting even the most genuine connections. And slowly, quietly, their communication faded, not out of conflict, but out of timing that never quite aligned. The silence that followed was not born from anger or misunderstanding. It was shaped by respect, caution, and the belief that sometimes letting go was an act of care rather than abandonment. Yet even as time moved forward, as years passed and chapters closed, something remained unfinished, like a sentence paused mid-thought, waiting patiently for its ending. The world, unaware of this quiet history, continued on, celebrating their individual journeys, analyzing interviews, replaying old moments, and speculating endlessly without understanding that what truly mattered was not what had happened, but what had been carried silently all along. For Keanu, the memories lived in moments of reflection, during long rides through quiet streets, or when he paused before answering a question that brushed too close to the past. For Sandra, they surfaced in unexpected ways, through laughter that suddenly softened, or during moments of stillness when she allowed herself to remember how connection can change a person without ever demanding anything in return. Years later, when the world had almost accepted that their story belonged entirely to the past, something shifted. It did not arrive with fanfare or announcement. It arrived quietly, like all meaningful things do. A chance encounter, carefully unplanned yet deeply intentional, placed them in the same space again, not as the people they once were, but as individuals shaped by time, experience, and growth. There was no rush, no pressure to fill the silence immediately. Instead, they allowed it to exist between them, acknowledging it rather than fearing it. In that shared silence, something unexpected happened. It no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. It felt like space made for understanding rather than distance. They spoke slowly at first, choosing words with care, not because they were afraid, but because they finally understood the value of speaking with intention. Each conversation was less about revisiting the past, and more about recognizing how much they had grown, how pain had taught them compassion, and how absence had revealed the depth of what once was. For the first time, neither felt the need to perform, explain, or protect themselves from vulnerability. They spoke about resilience, about the quiet strength it takes to keep going when life offers no clear answers, and about kindness as a deliberate choice rather than a spontaneous act. These were not conversations meant for the world to hear. They were exchanges meant to heal, to acknowledge, and to bring clarity to emotions that had waited patiently for resolution. What surprised them both was how natural it felt to reconnect, not as a continuation of the past, but as something entirely new. They were no longer defined by who they had been back then. They were defined by who they had become. The silence that once separated them had transformed into a bridge, allowing them to meet again without expectation or pressure. It was no longer about what could have been. It was about what could exist now, grounded in mutual respect, understanding, and emotional honesty. As word slowly began to spread that they had been seen together again, the world responded with curiosity and excitement, unaware that the most meaningful part of their reunion had nothing to do with appearances. It was about two people choosing presence over avoidance, honesty over assumption, and compassion over fear. Their decision to stand side by side again was not a declaration meant to impress, but a quiet affirmation of something deeply human. That connection, when nurtured with patience and sincerity, can survive even the longest silence. In that moment, as cameras flashed and voices murmured, Keanu and Sandra shared a look that needed no explanation. It was not a look of triumph or validation. It was a look of understanding, of shared growth, and of acceptance that life does not always follow the paths we imagine, but sometimes leads us exactly where we need to be, even if it takes years to arrive. Their appearance together was not the beginning of a story, nor was it the end. It was a reminder that resilience is often quiet, that love and connection do not always announce themselves loudly, and that silence, when honored rather than feared, can become the foundation for something stronger than before. For those watching, it was easy to focus on the moment itself. But for Keanu and Sandra, it was about everything that had led them there, the lessons learned, the patience practiced, and the understanding that true connection does not fade with time. It simply waits for the right moment to speak again. When healing begins without an audience, what neither Keanu nor Sandra realized at first was that appearing together again was only the surface of something far deeper that had already begun to unfold long before the world noticed. The real transformation had started quietly, in moments unseen, in conversations that carried no urgency and demanded no outcome. Healing, after all, rarely announces itself. It arrives gently, often disguised as familiarity, patience, and the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. For Keanu, this phase felt unfamiliar in a strangely comforting way. He had spent much of his life learning how to survive loss by moving forward with humility and grace, but reconnecting with Sandra required a different kind of courage, one that asked him not just to endure, but to open himself again without armor. Sandra felt it too, though she processed it differently. Where Keanu leaned into reflection, she leaned into awareness. She noticed how her thoughts softened after their conversations, how the tension she hadn't realized she carried began to loosen. There was no pressure to define what they were or where they were going, and that absence of labels gave her room to breathe. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to be strong for anyone. She was simply present, allowing herself to feel without judgment. The silence that once felt uncomfortable had transformed into something steady and reassuring, like a shared understanding that words did not always need to lead. Their reconnection unfolded slowly, shaped by mutual respect rather than urgency. They met not in grand settings, but in ordinary moments that carried extraordinary weight. Long walks where conversations drifted naturally between memories, lessons, and reflections on life. Shared laughter that didn't try to reclaim the past, but acknowledged it with warmth. Discussions about resilience, about how pain can either isolate or connect people depending on how they choose to carry it. These moments were not rehearsed or curated. They were real, grounded, and deeply human. What stood out most was how they listened to each other, not with the intent to respond, but with the intention to understand. Keanu listened with the same attentiveness that had guided him through years of personal growth, offering presence rather than solutions. Sandra listened with openness, allowing vulnerability to exist without immediately trying to manage it. In these exchanges, they found something rare, emotional safety. There was no fear of being misunderstood, no need to protect old wounds. They acknowledged their past silence not as a mistake, but as a chapter that had taught them patience, perspective, and the importance of timing. As days turned into weeks, they became more aware of how their individual journeys had shaped them into people capable of meeting each other again with clarity rather than confusion. Keanu spoke openly about how solitude had taught him compassion, not just for others, but for himself. Sandra shared how independence had strengthened her, yet also revealed the importance of allowing others to walk beside her rather than always forging ahead alone. These were not confessions meant to impress, but truths offered freely, without expectation of validation. The world, of course, began to take notice. Speculation grew, narratives formed, and assumptions spread quickly, as they often do. But what made this moment different was how little it mattered to them. Their connection was no longer defined by external perception. It was grounded in something far more resilient: shared values, kindness that did not need recognition, perseverance that did not seek reward, empathy that existed without condition. These principles guided how they moved forward, shaping every interaction with intention rather than impulse. There were moments of uncertainty, naturally. Healing is never linear, and revisiting old connections can stir emotions that feel both familiar and foreign. Yet instead of retreating into silence as they once had, they addressed these moments with honesty. They spoke about boundaries, about expectations, and about the importance of allowing growth to happen without rushing it. This openness created a foundation built not on nostalgia, but on trust. Trust that they could navigate complexity without losing themselves or each other. For Keanu, this period marked a shift from quiet endurance to quiet participation. He realized that allowing someone back into his emotional world did not diminish his independence, but enriched it. For Sandra, it marked a transition from self-reliance to shared strength. She discovered that vulnerability did not weaken her resilience, but expanded it, allowing her to experience connection without sacrificing autonomy. Together, they demonstrated something powerful yet often overlooked: that healing does not require dramatic gestures, only consistent care. Their choice to move forward together, even cautiously, became a subtle example of what emotional maturity looks like. It was not about erasing the past or rewriting history. It was about honoring it while refusing to be confined by it. They understood that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the ability to grow beyond it without bitterness. That empathy is not passive, but an active commitment to understanding another person's experience. And that kindness, when practiced consistently, can rebuild bridges that time once seemed to erase. As they continued to appear together, not as a spectacle but as two individuals aligned by intention, their presence carried a quiet message. It reminded people that meaningful connections are not defined by speed or spectacle, but by patience and presence. That silence does not always signal the end, but sometimes prepares the ground for something more honest to grow. And that when people choose understanding over assumption, they create space for healing that benefits not only themselves, but everyone who witnesses it. By the end of this chapter, Keanu and Sandra were no longer simply reconnecting. They were consciously choosing a path shaped by mutual respect, emotional clarity, and a shared belief in the power of gentle perseverance. What lay ahead was still undefined, and that uncertainty no longer frightened them. Instead, it felt like possibility, open and unforced, waiting to be shaped not by expectation, but by intention. Choosing presence over fear. As time continued to move forward, Keanu and Sandra found themselves standing at a quiet crossroads that neither of them had anticipated, yet both recognized instantly. It was not a moment defined by dramatic decisions or spoken declarations, but by an internal understanding that what they were building required intention. The comfort they felt in each other's presence had grown steadily, rooted in trust and mutual respect. And with that comfort came the responsibility of choosing how deeply they were willing to step into something meaningful again. Both had learned from life that fear often disguises itself as caution, and growth demands the courage to tell the difference. Keanu felt this awareness settle in during moments of stillness, when he reflected on how differently he approached connection now compared to years earlier. He understood that he no longer sought completeness through another person, but companionship that honored wholeness. His experiences had taught him that love, in its most resilient form, does not demand possession or certainty, but thrives on freedom and honesty. Sitting with these realizations, he recognized that choosing presence with Sandra did not mean abandoning his quiet nature, but rather sharing it in a way that felt balanced and sincere. Sandra experienced her own reckoning, shaped by an emotional clarity she had cultivated over time. She had learned to recognize when she was protecting herself out of wisdom, and when she was doing so out of fear. Being with Keanu again brought this distinction into sharp focus. There were moments when vulnerability felt risky, when the memory of silence lingered at the edges of her thoughts, but she also recognized how different this felt from the past. This was not about longing for what once was, but about honoring what was unfolding naturally. She realized that allowing herself to be fully present was an act of courage, one that required trust not only in Keanu, but in her own growth. Their conversations grew richer, moving beyond reflection and into intention. They spoke about values rather than outcomes, about how they wanted to move through life rather than where they wanted to end up. These discussions revealed a shared philosophy shaped by experience. That kindness should guide action, that perseverance should be gentle rather than forceful, and that empathy begins with listening without judgment. In choosing to align themselves with these principles, they created a foundation that felt sustainable, one that did not rely on external validation or dramatic milestones to feel real. There were moments when they acknowledged the weight of being seen together, aware that attention often simplifies what is complex. Yet instead of allowing this awareness to create pressure, they approached it with grounded humility. They understood that public perception would always exist, but it did not need to dictate their choices. What mattered most was how they treated each other in private moments, how they navigated disagreement with respect, and how they supported each other's individuality rather than attempting to merge identities. Keanu found fulfillment in offering steady presence, something he had always valued but now practiced with renewed awareness. He learned that presence is not passive. It requires attentiveness, patience, and emotional availability. Sandra, in turn, found strength in allowing herself to lean without losing balance, discovering that interdependence does not diminish independence, but can enhance it when approached with care. Together, they demonstrated that emotional resilience is not about standing alone, but about knowing when to stand together. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened through shared routines and quiet rituals that carried meaning without spectacle. Morning conversations that set intentions for the day, reflective pauses that allowed space for gratitude, and moments of shared silence that felt full rather than empty. These practices reinforced a sense of continuity, reminding them that meaningful connection is built through consistency rather than intensity. Each interaction became an opportunity to choose understanding over assumption, patience over impulse, and presence over fear. In these choices, they found something transformative. The fear that once hovered at the edges of connection began to lose its power, replaced by confidence rooted in self-awareness. They no longer avoided difficult conversations or uncomfortable emotions. Instead, they approached them as essential components of growth. This shift allowed their connection to mature beyond attraction or nostalgia into something grounded and enduring, shaped by mutual accountability and respect. For those who observed from afar, their continued appearances together seemed effortless, almost serene. What remained unseen was the intentional effort behind that ease, the quiet work of choosing empathy even when it would be easier to retreat, of choosing honesty even when it felt vulnerable. Their journey became a subtle testament to the idea that resilience is cultivated not through avoidance of discomfort, but through engagement with it in thoughtful and compassionate ways. By choosing presence over fear, Keanu and Sandra redefined what connection meant to them. It was no longer something to be protected through distance or silence, but something to be nurtured through openness and trust. They understood that the future did not need to be mapped in detail to feel secure, as long as their actions aligned with their values. In this understanding, they found peace not as an endpoint, but as a guiding principle that allowed them to move forward with clarity and purpose. Standing together without losing ourselves. As their connection continued to deepen, Keanu and Sandra began to recognize a new challenge, emerging quietly alongside the comfort they had built. The responsibility of standing together while remaining true to themselves as individuals. This stage of their journey was not marked by uncertainty about each other, but by a thoughtful awareness of how easily meaningful connections can lose balance when external forces begin to pull at them. They understood that unity does not mean fusion, and that the strength of what they were building depended on honoring the space each of them needed to remain grounded, reflective, and whole. Keanu approached this phase with the same mindfulness that had guided him through life's most difficult lessons. He believed deeply that purpose must be rooted in intention rather than reaction, and that shared paths are healthiest when both people continue walking in alignment with their values. He spoke openly about the importance of protecting inner stillness, about how silence, when chosen consciously, can nourish clarity rather than create distance. Sandra listened with appreciation, recognizing that this perspective mirrored her own evolving understanding of strength, one that no longer relied on constant motion, but on thoughtful direction. Sandra, for her part, felt a renewed sense of responsibility toward herself. She had spent years mastering independence, learning how to navigate challenges with determination and confidence, yet this chapter invited her to redefine independence not as isolation, but as self-trust. She realized that standing beside someone did not mean stepping back from her own voice or vision. Instead, it offered an opportunity to practice mutual support without compromise. In expressing this openly, she discovered that being honest about her needs strengthened their connection rather than straining it. Together, they began to articulate what shared purpose meant to them, not as a singular goal, but as a philosophy of living. They spoke about using visibility responsibly, about choosing kindness even when scrutiny intensified, and about understanding that influence carries weight whether one seeks it or not. These conversations were not abstract ideals, but practical reflections shaped by experience. They agreed that any path forward must allow room for service, humility, and authenticity, values that had sustained them individually and now guided them collectively. As attention from the outside world continued to grow, they approached it with calm resolve rather than resistance. They understood that public curiosity often reduces complex human stories into simplified narratives, yet they chose not to internalize those interpretations. Instead, they focused on consistency in how they treated one another, knowing that integrity is demonstrated not through explanation, but through action over time. This approach allowed them to move through public moments without losing the intimacy and sincerity of their private connection. There were instances when external pressure tested their patience, moments when assumptions threatened to overshadow reality, but they addressed these challenges with openness rather than defensiveness. By acknowledging discomfort rather than avoiding it, they prevented misunderstandings from taking root. This willingness to confront difficulty together reinforced a shared resilience that felt earned rather than assumed. They learned that strength is not measured by the absence of strain, but by the ability to navigate it with respect and understanding intact. Keanu found renewed meaning in collaboration that honored individuality. He appreciated how Sandra's perspective challenged him to articulate thoughts he once held quietly, while still respecting his natural inclination toward introspection. Sandra, in turn, valued how Keanu's steadiness encouraged patience and reflection, offering balance to her instinctive drive. This exchange did not dilute who they were, but refined it, allowing each to grow without feeling overshadowed. Their shared moments became defined not by spectacle, but by alignment. Whether engaged in conversation about purpose or simply sharing silence with intention, they demonstrated that connection does not require constant affirmation to remain strong. What sustained them was mutual trust, reinforced through consistent behavior rather than promises. This steadiness created a sense of security that did not depend on certainty about the future, but on confidence in how they would face it together. Through this phase, Keanu and Sandra embodied a quiet message that resonated beyond their immediate experience. That standing together does not mean losing oneself, and that shared purpose is most powerful when it allows room for individuality. Their journey illustrated that resilience grows when people choose cooperation over control, empathy over assumption, and presence over performance. In honoring these principles, they continued to move forward with clarity, grounded in the understanding that meaningful connection is sustained not by intensity, but by intention practiced daily. The strength of choosing again. As their journey continued, Keanu and Sandra arrived at a realization that felt both simple and profound. Meaningful connection is not something chosen once, but something chosen again and again, especially when the novelty fades and only intention remains. This understanding did not arrive through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation, shaped by consistent actions, thoughtful conversations, and the shared discipline of showing up even on days when uncertainty lingered. They recognized that what they were building now was fundamentally different from anything rooted in the past, because it was sustained not by momentum, but by mindful commitment. For Keanu, this phase deepened his appreciation for deliberate choice. He understood that love, in its most enduring form, is not a feeling that carries people effortlessly forward, but a practice that requires awareness and responsibility. He reflected on how often people confuse intensity with depth, and how easily they abandon connections when effort becomes necessary. In choosing Sandra repeatedly, not out of obligation but out of alignment, he found a sense of purpose that felt grounded and honest. It reaffirmed his belief that perseverance, when guided by compassion, becomes a source of quiet strength rather than strain. Sandra, too, felt the weight and clarity of this choice. She realized that her strength was no longer defined by how much she could carry alone, but by how intentionally she allowed herself to share the load. Choosing again did not mean surrendering independence. It meant trusting discernment. She found confidence in knowing that she was not stepping into something uncertain blindly, but with eyes open, informed by experience and guided by self-respect. This awareness allowed her to engage fully without fear of losing herself in the process. Together, they explored what commitment meant in a context shaped by maturity rather than expectation. It was not about promises designed to secure the future, but about agreements to remain present, honest, and respectful in the present moment. They spoke openly about boundaries, about the importance of space as well as closeness, and about the need to continue growing as individuals while supporting each other's evolution. These conversations were not burdensome. They were empowering, offering clarity where ambiguity once lived. As their bond strengthened, they became more attuned to how their choices influenced not only their relationship, but their inner lives. Keanu noticed a renewed calm, a sense that his values were not just guiding him individually, but being reflected back through shared experience. Sandra observed a steadiness within herself, a balance between confidence and humility that allowed her to navigate challenges with grace rather than urgency. This mutual reinforcement created a rhythm that felt sustainable, free from the extremes of emotional highs and lows. Public moments continued to unfold, but they no longer felt defining. Instead, they served as reminders of the importance of consistency behind the scenes. Keanu and Sandra understood that authenticity cannot be maintained through performance, but through alignment between values and actions. By focusing on how they treated each other away from attention, they preserved the integrity of what they shared, ensuring that external narratives did not erode internal truth. There were challenges, naturally, moments when fatigue or doubt surfaced, as they do in any meaningful endeavor. Yet instead of viewing these moments as signs of weakness, they treated them as opportunities for deeper understanding. By addressing tension with empathy rather than avoidance, they strengthened their capacity to navigate complexity together. This approach transformed obstacles into points of connection rather than division, reinforcing trust rather than testing it. Through choosing again, Keanu and Sandra demonstrated a form of resilience often overlooked, the resilience of commitment made consciously rather than impulsively. Their story reflected the idea that hope is not a passive emotion, but an active decision to continue investing care, attention, and effort even when certainty is absent. In making this choice repeatedly, they cultivated a quiet confidence, one that did not depend on guarantees, but on faith in shared values and mutual respect. By the close of this chapter, their connection felt less like a question and more like a practice, one sustained by intention rather than assumption. They understood that the strength of what they were building lay not in its visibility, but in its foundation, built steadily through kindness, perseverance, and empathy. This understanding did not mark an ending, but a transition, preparing them for the final stage of their journey, where presence becomes purpose and connection evolves into something enduring. When silence becomes a beginning. By the time Keanu and Sandra reached this chapter of their journey, they understood something that once felt impossible to articulate. Silence had never been the enemy of their connection, only the space in which it was shaped. What once felt like distance had become perspective, and what once felt unfinished had transformed into understanding. They no longer carried questions that demanded immediate answers, because they had learned that clarity emerges naturally when people move with integrity rather than urgency. In this realization, they found peace, not as an ending, but as a steady presence guiding them forward. Keanu felt this peace most clearly in moments of stillness, when reflection no longer carried weight but offered balance. He recognized how far he had come, not just in reconnecting with Sandra, but in reconnecting with himself. The years of quiet endurance, of choosing humility over bitterness and kindness over resentment, had prepared him for this stage where connection felt aligned rather than complicated. He understood now that resilience is not about surviving silence, but about listening to what silence teaches, and allowing those lessons to inform how one chooses to love, to trust, and to remain open. Sandra experienced her own sense of completion, shaped by confidence earned rather than assumed. She no longer measured strength by how little she needed others, but by how honestly she could engage without fear of losing herself. Being present with Keanu felt natural, not because it erased uncertainty, but because it allowed uncertainty to exist without control. She recognized that vulnerability, when grounded in self-awareness, becomes a source of empowerment rather than risk. This understanding freed her from the need to protect herself from every possible outcome, and allowed her to live fully within the present moment. Together, they moved forward not with declarations, but with consistency. Their actions reflected alignment rather than intention alone, and this quiet reliability became the most powerful affirmation of what they shared. They did not attempt to define their future in rigid terms, understanding that life evolves regardless of plans. Instead, they focused on how they would face whatever came next, committed to empathy, respect, and patience as guiding principles. This approach allowed them to experience connection as something dynamic, capable of adapting without losing its core. What made their journey particularly meaningful was how it extended beyond themselves. Without intending to become symbols, they embodied a message that resonated deeply with those who observed from afar. Their story reminded people that meaningful reconnection does not require dramatic apologies or grand gestures, but honest presence and willingness to grow. That time apart does not erase what is real, but can refine it. And that choosing kindness, especially when silence would be easier, can transform relationships in ways that endurance alone never could. Keanu and Sandra understood that the resilience they had cultivated was not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to meet difficulty without losing compassion. They demonstrated that perseverance is most powerful when paired with gentleness, and that empathy is not just an emotional response, but a daily practice. These values guided their interactions, shaping a connection rooted not in perfection, but in mutual understanding and acceptance. As they continued their journey together, they did so with gratitude rather than expectation. Gratitude for the lessons learned during years of silence, for the growth that allowed reconnection to feel healthy rather than fragile, and for the opportunity to choose presence over fear. They did not view their story as something reclaimed, but as something newly formed, shaped by time, intention, and emotional maturity. In the end, their silence did not mark a loss, but a transformation. It created space for reflection, for healing, and for the kind of understanding that only comes through patience. When they finally stood together, not as echoes of the past, but as individuals aligned in the present, they embodied the quiet truth that resilience is built through consistent care, that love grows through intentional choice, and that sometimes what feels like an ending is simply the beginning waiting to be recognized.